Chapter 23, Endocrine Control of Growth and Metabolism. In this chapter, we'll talk about our adrenal glucocorticoids. We'll also discuss thyroid hormone, growth hormone, and examine tissue and bone growth, as well as calcium balance. So to review the endocrine system, which was covered in Chapter 7, just keep in mind that the hypothalamus and pituitary controls the release of a lot of our hormones. Our hormones are also regulated by negative feedback. That's the one that typically dominates. So these feedback patterns, especially negative feedback, ensures that we're going to bring balance to the system. The action of our hormones are really dictated by the receptors. And some of these receptors are on the surface of our cells, some are inside the cells, and depending on whether our hormone is a protein or a steroid, it will bind to the appropriate receptor that it can reach. And typically we see a cellular response, whether we're going to alter existing hormones or make existing proteins or make new proteins. And the magnitude of the response will depend on how much hormone is released and bind to its receptors. And things can go wrong. So there are some pathologies that can happen. Typically you are producing either too much hormone, too little hormone, or there's an issue with the receptor. So our adrenal glucocorticoids, they are released by our adrenal gland. So if we take a look at our adrenal gland, we have our adrenal medulla in the middle, which releases our catecholamines, mostly epinephrine, which is associated with that sympathetic nervous system. Then we have in the adrenal cortex the zona reticularis, which releases sex hormones, zona fasciculata, which releases glucocorticoids like cortisol, and then zona glomerulosa, which releases the hormone aldosterone, which works on the kidneys. And just to remind you, again, we get our steroid hormones from cholesterol. So our sex hormones like DHT, estradiol, and then we have other hormones like cortisol and aldosterone. So let's talk about cortisol. So cortisol is known as your stress hormone, and it is released through the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. So the hypothalamus will release the hormone or tropic hormone CRH. CRH stands for corticotropin releasing hormone. It will go through the portal system to the anterior pituitary and cause the release of the endocrine glands here to release ACTH. ACTH stands for adrenal corticotropic hormone. Then ACTH will go to the adrenal gland and cause the release of cortisol, so specifically the adrenal cortex, and cause the release of cortisol. So cortisol, our stress hormone, our final hormone, is going to do things that cause our body to break down and to also raise blood glucose. So it causes the liver to undergo gluconeogenesis. So if you take a look at the word, genesis is creating, neo means new, glucose, you should think of glucose. So this is creating glucose from things that were not glucose before, new things. Our muscles will break down protein and release them into the blood. We will also break down our adipose tissue. And we will also decrease the activity of the bone marrow, which suppresses the immune system and causes a suppression in immune function. This is why people tend to get sick a lot when they are stressed. And cortisol is released in a rhythmic pattern, so it tends to be higher in the morning and lower at night. And that makes sense because in the morning, you want to release cortisol to kind of get your body going. So what does cortisol do? Again, it really helps prevent hypoglycemia. So by having that catabolic effect on the body, breaking our body down, we're going to release the substrates into the blood. So our liver will make new glucose. The breakdown of our muscles can cause the release of proteins. We'll again break down lipids. We'll suppress the immune system. And stress can also affect brain function. So we really want to make sure that we know how to manage stress appropriately. So there are therapeutic ways, or there are ways we can use cortisol in a therapeutic way. So we know what it does. Why don't we use it to our advantage? For example, we know that cortisol suppresses the immune system. So it's used when we want to suppress the immune system. For example, it inhibits the inflammatory response. It can be used to treat allergy reactions, for example, to bee stings or poison ivy. Now we can have pathology, so too much or too little cortisol secretion. So here's an example of too much. So hypercortisolism. And there are three common causes. One is an adrenal tumor. Remember, if we have a tumor, it tends to oversecrete a hormone. So in this case, this tumor in the adrenal gland is just automatically, all by itself, secreting too much cortisol. We also have Cushing's disease, and Cushing's disease is a tumor in the pituitary that's secreting too much ACTH, and that ACTH from the pituitary is then causing our adrenal gland to make too much cortisol. So this would be an example of a secondary pathology, whereas the tumor in the adrenal gland would be a primary. And then it could be iatrogenic. Remember, this is physician caused. So it occurs secondary to cortisol therapy for some other condition, or that's one example. And there's a classic appearance of hypercortisolism. We have thin arms and legs, we have obesity in the trunk area, and a moon face, which are these really plump red cheeks. If you can have hyper, we can certainly have hypocortisolism. So this is too little cortisol produced in the body. This is less common than Cushing's disease, and an example is Addison's disease. So here we have hyposecretion, low secretion of all of our adrenal steroid hormones. And we think it's because the immune system is destroying the adrenal cortex. So let's move on to thyroid hormone. So our thyroid gland, you can see here, we have a cross section of it. And we're going to identify some of the cells within the thyroid gland. So the first cell is our follicular cell. And this follicular cell, shown in pink, that kind of makes this circle, this is who's actually going to secrete our thyroid hormone. In the middle of our follicular cell, okay, or in the middle of the circle that it creates, we have a colloid, which is just a glycoprotein. And this is going to hold about a 2 to 3 month supply of thyroid hormone. And then we have this other cell here, this pink guy over here. This is our C cell. He secretes calcitonin. And I'm going to talk about this later on when we talk about calcium. So just keep that in mind. C cells, calcitonin, calcium. So thyroid hormone, let's make it and release it. So thyroid hormone, we need some things from our diet. So we need iodine and we need the amino acid tyrosine. So iodine is going to be obtained through our diet, and it will come into the follicular cell. And within the follicular cell, we will produce certain proteins and enzymes that are necessary to make thyroid hormone. And all of it will go into the colloid, and the enzymes are going to do its thing, and it's going to create thyroid hormone. So to do that, we will first create MIT. So the M stands for mono, which means one, I for iodo, T for tyrosine. So we're going to attach one iodine to tyrosine. That gives us our monoiodotyrosine. Then we're going to take that MIT and attach another iodine, which is going to give us 2. So we're going to change the prefix to di for 2. So DIT, diiodotyrosine. Then we're going to take a M and a D, so a mono and a di, 1 and a 2, and put it together. So then we have T3. Or we're going to take a di and a di and put it together. So 2 plus 2 is our T4. And we're going to store this in the colloid until we need it to be released. And when thyroid hormone is stimulated to be released, we will release it in the form of T3 and T4. And both are released, but T3 is our thyroid hormone, which means our T4 will lose an iodine in the blood and become T3. So what does thyroid hormone do? Well, it affects the quality of our life, which basically means without thyroid hormone, we will not perish, but our quality of life will suffer. So thyroid hormone affects things like our body temperature, our mood, and its main function is to provide substrates for oxidative metabolism. In children, it's necessary for normal growth and development, and it's also been known to be involved in myelin and synapse formation. So we can certainly have too much and too little thyroid hormone. So too much is hyperthyroidism. And it's basically going to increase metabolism. So think of turning on the engine of our body, okay, into overdrive. So we're going to have increased oxygen consumption, so increased respiratory rate, increased heart rate, which is tachycardia. We're going to have metabolic heat production, protein catabolism, which can cause muscle weakness. And we'll be hyperexcitable. Our reflexes will be really excited. We'll have irritability, insomnia, psychosis. So kind of our body's in overdrive. Hypothyroidism is where you have too little thyroid hormone produced. Everything kind of slows down. So we have slow metabolic rate. So you tend to gain weight easily, or it's difficult to lose weight, versus with hyperthyroidism, because your metabolic rate is so fast, you find it difficult to put on weight or keep weight or build weight. With hypothyroidism, we'll also have decreased oxygen consumption, decreased heart rate, which is bradycardia, low protein synthesis, which in adults can lead to brittle nails, thin hair, dry and thin skin, and in kids, it can lead to slow bone and tissue growth. Our reflexes are also slowed, so we can see that with speech, our thought processes, and just overall fatigue. And in infants, without enough thyroid hormone, it can lead to creatinism. This is a condition marked by decreased mental capacity, because remember, thyroid hormone is involved in synapse formation. So how is it released, or it's stimulated to be released? So our hypothalamus will release TRH, which stands for thyrotropin releasing hormone. And it will go through our hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system to our anterior pituitary and stimulate these endocrine cells to release TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. And it tells you what it does. It stimulates the thyroid hormone, or the thyroid gland, to release thyroid hormone. So it's going to go to the thyroid gland and stimulate the release of thyroid hormone. Remember, it gets released as T4 and T3, but the T4 will lose an iodine and turn into T3, which is our main thyroid hormone. So let's look at some issues that can arise. So remember, we need iodine in our diet to make thyroid hormone. So if we have a diet deficiency of iodine, then our T3 and T4 levels are going to be low, which essentially means our body will sense that thyroid hormone levels are low, so the hypothalamus will stimulate the release of TRH, which should stimulate the anterior pituitary to release TSH, which should stimulate the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. But this step is compromised because it doesn't have the substrates to make thyroid hormone. So T3 and T4 remains low, which means there's no negative feedback. So the stimuli continues, and what that results in is an enlarged thyroid gland, because you are constantly stimulating the thyroid gland, and the cells start to respond to that and increase in size. So this increased thyroid gland, which an extreme example is shown here, is known as a goiter. But just because you see a goiter in someone does not mean that they have hypothyroidism. It could also mean they have hyper, and here's an example. And this is Graves' disease. And Graves' disease, you will see hyperthyroidism as well as a goiter. And what happens here is, and this is known as an autoimmune disease, but in this instance, our immune system doesn't destroy our thyroid gland. It actually produces an antibody, and it's known as thyroid stimulating immunoglobulin. Immunoglobulin is an antibody. And it does what the name says. It stimulates the thyroid gland. So basically, TSI, thyroid stimulating immunoglobulin, acts exactly the same as TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. So this TSI, made by our immune cells, will stimulate the thyroid gland to release T3 and T4. So our T3, T4 levels will rise. We will have hyperthyroidism. And this increase in thyroid hormone will cause a strong negative feedback back up to the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus, because it's too high. So we want to stop the release. And so TRH levels will be low, TSH levels will be low, but we won't stop making thyroid hormone, because it isn't this normal axis that's causing it. It's this other immunoglobulin, this other antibody that's stimulating it. And this antibody is not subject to this negative feedback. So because, again, you're constantly stimulating the thyroid gland, it will enlarge and lead to a goiter. Another thing that you will see with Graves' disease is a condition called exophthalmos, and this is a bug-eyed appearance caused by immune-mediated enlargement of the muscles and tissues around the eye socket. Now, for normal growth, we need several things. We need hormones like growth hormone, thyroid hormone, insulin, sex hormones. These are just some of the major examples. We also need an adequate diet. We've already seen one example of how we need iodine in our diet to make thyroid hormone, but we also need glucose, for example, to make energy. We need amino acids, especially our essential amino acids, to build our body's proteins. We need vitamins and minerals. So, an adequate diet is important for normal growth and development. Another is an absence of stress. Now, this doesn't mean you can't stress your kids out at all, but we don't want excessive stress because stress results in cortisol release. And cortisol is going to, again, have an overall catabolic effect on the body. And so it'll inhibit growth. And then your genes play a role. So one's adult size is genetically determined at conception. So speaking of growth hormone, how is growth hormone released? So again, it's necessary for growth and development, but growth hormone is kind of different in the way that its release is controlled. So what happens is the hypothalamus can release either GHRH, which stands for growth hormone releasing hormone, or it can release somatostatin. Now, growth hormone releasing hormone has that little plus. That means it's going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. Somatostatin has a little negative sign. That means it's going to inhibit the release of growth hormone. So notice this is different than the release of cortisol or thyroid hormone. We actually have two separate hormones from the hypothalamus that can either stimulate or inhibit the release of growth hormone. Another thing that's different about growth hormone is it is directly released by the anterior pituitary. There isn't some other organ that that the tropic hormone from the anterior pituitary has to go to release the final hormone. So growth hormone will stimulate growth of bones and tissues. It'll increase blood glucose. It can also cause the liver and other tissues to release another hormone called IGF, which is insulin-like growth factor. And that will stimulate cartilage growth. But just keep in mind, this is not the same as insulin, so don't get that confused. So growth hormone is secreted throughout life, even though we think of growth hormone just during growth, right? So we don't think of it as being important in adulthood, but it is. And the secretion of growth hormone is controlled by things like stress, cortisol, circulating nutrients, other hormones, and our circadian rhythm, our sleep-wake cycle. Again, to remind you, the GHRH hormone stimulates, whereas somatostatin inhibits the release of growth hormone. And it can also stimulate IGF release. And growth hormone and IGF together are anabolic and really promotes protein synthesis. Now, let's take a look at some abnormalities or pathologies. So here we have first severe growth hormone deficiency in children. So as a child, when you're really trying to grow, if you have a severe deficiency in growth hormone, it can lead to dwarfism, which is basically stunted growth. If you have oversecretion of growth hormone as a child, then it leads to gigantism or giantism, so you grow really big. And then, let's say growth hormone is released normally as a child, so you grow into normal adulthood size. But then after you've become an adult, you start to have oversecretion of growth hormone. Maybe a tumor is causing it. Then it leads to a condition called acromegaly. And it's characterized by lengthening of the jaw, coarsening of the facial features, growth of hands and feet. And if you've seen the movie The Princess Bride, Andre the Giant in that movie had acromegaly. And this woman grew to adulthood, so she looks like a normal adult female. And then she started to secrete too much growth hormone, and you can see the coarsening of her facial features, the lengthening of the jaw. Now, for tissue growth, we need hormones as well as paracrines. Paracrine is just a chemical released by a cell that acts on another cell. We also need, again, hormones like growth hormone, IGF needs to be released. But interestingly, thyroid hormone and insulin, which both need to be released, they also play a permissive role for growth hormone. So if you recall, we talked about permissiveness. That's where one hormone needs to be present for a second hormone to act to its fullest potential. So what that's saying is growth hormone needs thyroid hormone and insulin to work to its fullest potential. And in addition, for normal growth, we need thyroid and insulin no matter what as well. Okay, so tissue and bone growth. So bone growth requires things like hormones, but also adequate diet. In this case, we really do need calcium because our bone is made up of calcium phosphate crystals. So here we can see our osteoporosis blasts building new bone. Osteoclasts would be the ones that actually break bone. And because bone is made up really of calcium, let's make sure we understand calcium and its function in the body and where it's found. So 99% of our body's calcium is found in our bone. 0.1% is in our extracellular fluid and 0.9% is found intracellularly. So if you recall, we talked about some functions of calcium already. It can act as a signaling molecule inside cells. Remember, it causes exocytosis. It's also involved in tight junction formation. We also need it, for example, we didn't talk about this yet, but coagulation cascade. So blood clotting, we need it. For muscle contractions, we need calcium. Let's see, what else? Did I miss anything? No. Okay, so calcium's important. So let's regulate blood calcium. How do we do that? So this is a good summary figure that really shows us. So here's our ECF, extracellular fluid calcium. So I'm going to think of this as what will eventually be in the blood. Okay. Now there are several places where we can regulate calcium. So if you recall, 99% of our calcium is found in our bone. So obviously our bone is going to play an important role in blood calcium levels. So the bones are drawn here. We also get calcium from our diet, and we absorb things from our diet from our small intestine. So the small intestines are seen here because they're going to be important in calcium regulation or levels. And then the kidneys are shown here. And the reason is because we can actually excrete calcium, lose it in our urine. Okay, so obviously the kidneys play a role in blood calcium. So if we understand that all three areas are important, it's easy to figure out what would happen when blood calcium is too low. So let's start with that. Let's say our blood calcium levels are too low. We have hypocalcemia. Then we're going to want to raise our blood calcium levels. So here's what we can do. We know calcium is stored in our bone. So we have a big storage of calcium here. We need it out here in our blood. So why don't we just take it out of our bone? So we would stimulate our osteoclasts to break bone and release the calcium into our blood. We also have low blood calcium, and so what we would want to do is the calcium that we ate, the dietary calcium that's going through our small intestine, we're going to try to absorb all of it, okay, to help raise our blood calcium. So that would be another thing we can do. And then finally, we are going to filter blood, including calcium, into our kidneys, into the nephron of our kidneys. So what do we want to do with that calcium that we filtered? We actually want to reabsorb it all back. Because our blood calcium is already low, we don't want to lose any in our urine. And so these are the three things that we would do in these three areas when blood calcium is low. And so when blood calcium is low, we will release hormones to do just that. For example, parathyroid hormone, which raises blood calcium, will cause our bone to break down and release calcium into our blood. It will also indirectly cause us to absorb the calcium in our intestine. And I say indirectly because parathyroid hormone will stimulate the production of vitamin D or calcitriol, and then that will allow us to absorb the calcium in our intestine. And then PTH will also make sure that all of the calcium that we filter in our kidneys, we reabsorb it. And so you can see PTH with a little plus, and the direction of calcium is going from the kidney into our blood. Another hormone that raises blood calcium is calcitriol. So calcitriol will also allow us to get the calcium from our bones, so breaking our bones and releasing it into the blood. It will absorb the calcium in our intestine, and it can also impact our kidneys. Calcitonin causes our calcium to reduce, to go down. So when our calcium is too high, we would want to release calcitonin, and that will lower our blood calcium. So if we want to lower calcium, we're actually going to take the calcium from our blood and put it into our bone, and you can see calcitonin doing that. And if our blood calcium is already too high and we want to lower it, we certainly don't want to absorb calcium in the intestine and bring more into the blood, so calcitonin will inhibit that. And it will also inhibit the reabsorption of calcium in the kidneys, which basically means we're going to lose the calcium in our urine. And so that will help lower blood calcium levels. Now, osteoclasts, again, are involved in the breaking down of our bone. So whenever we need to mobilize calcium from our bone, the osteoclast will release enzymes that will break our calcium and in the bone and release it into the blood. So here's a summary of those three hormones. So we have our parathyroid hormone, our calcitriol, and calcitonin. Okay, so parathyroid hormone and calcitriol raises calcium. Calcitriol, by the way, is made from vitamin D3, and calcitonin reduces calcium. And calcitonin we talked about earlier when we talked about the thyroid glands. Remember those C cells? We said C cells release calcitonin, which has to do with calcium. Oops, wrong way. Okay. Another hormone we're going to move on to next is released by the parathyroid gland. So the parathyroid gland are these four little glands found on the back of our thyroid gland. And parathyroid hormone we talked about already. So parathyroid hormone, we said earlier, raises our blood calcium. Okay, so really important. And then just keep in mind when we are talking about calcium in our bone or mobilizing it from our bone, remember our bone stores calcium as calcium phosphate crystals. So when we break our bone to release calcium, we are also releasing phosphate. And when we are building bone, we are also utilizing phosphate. And this is the same phosphate that you find in ATP, okay, the phosphate and the ATP. And then a pathology related to bone is osteoporosis, and this is something you might be familiar with. This is a loss in bone mineral density. So here we can see normal bone, and here we have an image of a bone that is suffering from osteoporosis, from someone suffering from osteoporosis. So we have increased resorption of bone, and we are not laying it down like we normally should. We're breaking it quicker than we should, and so it really results in bone that has become weakened, more fragile, and much more likely to fracture. So how do you combat this? Exercise is one way. Okay, so that is this chapter.